Okay, so this meeting is being recorded, and I welcome everybody to the Mental Health Awareness of Michiana webinar, Children Grieve 2, Recognizing and Supporting Grieving Children. My name is Lisa Kelly. I'm board president of MHAM, and happy to welcome you to our presentation tonight. So Holly Farmer is our speaker, and Holly received her Master's of Arts in Counseling Psychology from the University of Notre Dame in 1992, and a BS in Psychology from the Ohio State University in 1990. Holly holds an LMHC license in Indiana and has worked as a clinical counselor for a community outpatient counseling agency before joining the Center for Hospice Care in May of 2001. While working as a bereavement counselor at the CHC, Holly facilitated grief support groups for children, teens, and adults. She provided individual and family counseling and directed the annual Grief Camp for Youth, which is Camp Evergreen, from 2006 to 2014. Holly has presented at the annual symposium of the National Alliance for Grieving Children in 2007 and 11, and at the Palliative Care Association of Uganda conference in 2015 and 2017. In 2013, Holly became the Center for Hospice Care Bereavement Coordinator, and the role was reclassified to Director of Bereavement Services in 2020. The bereavement department has provided bereavement support to an average of over 3,000 bereaved a year for the past 6 years. So Holly, we welcome you and are so grateful that you're here to do this presentation. I do want to let folks know who are in attendance that if you have questions during Holly's presentation, you can use the chat box, or you can use the Q&A, and periodically, Holly will stop and ask for questions, and I'll go ahead and read them. So we won't be able to see you as participants or hear you. So please, feel free to just put questions or comments into the chat box or the Q&A. So Holly, I'm going to turn this over to you, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm going to share my screen. I'm honored to be with you all tonight to talk about grieving children. Like Lisa said, she can, if I haven't paused to ask for questions, if one comes through, she'll interrupt me. It's okay to do that so that we can answer those questions as they come. But know that if you have a question that doesn't get responded to, or if you have a question afterward that comes up, please know it's okay to reach out to me by email, and I will respond. So tonight, what we're going to do is talk about grief and mourning in children. I'll talk to you about developmental understanding of death and what that looks like at different ages. Talk about what is helpful for kids, what they need when they're grieving, and how to support them. And I'll also let you know about our bereavement services here at Center for Hospice Care. So the Center for Hospice Care is a hospice and palliative care organization that's been around for over 40 years that does provide hospice and palliative care services to people with serious illness and at end of life. And a part of that model of care is to provide bereavement support to the families of those patients after the patient has died. And our agency has also had a community bereavement program. So we provide grief counseling services to anyone in our service area that is grieving the death of someone. That person who died does not have to have been one of our patients. We also don't charge for our services, and our counseling services are offered to adults and children. And we do have offices here in Mishawaka, where I am, but we also have services in Elkhart, Plymouth, and LaPorte. I guess the main question is, do children and teens grieve? And as you see these images, these are kids who are smiling, who are doing fun things, creative things, and they are all grieving children. Children don't always look like they're grieving. They can look like they're doing okay. And so we need to make sure that we ask, and that will be a message that I kind of say multiple times throughout our time together. It's important to ask and check in with them because they don't always look like they're grieving. And that Ken Doka, someone who's well known in the field of thanatology, death and dying, and he talks about how children of any age can recognize loss, though they may respond to it in different ways. And we'll talk about some of those potential ways that kids can react. And that when a parent dies, it can really affect the child at the core of their existence. And so again, so important to be asking them and checking in with them to see how they're doing. We have Camp Evergreen, which Lisa mentioned in my bio. It's a grief camp for kids that we've done where this will be our 28th year of doing it. And one of our campers shared once that they cried and cried when they felt too much pain on their heart. And another camper, a teenager, shared that they really liked being able to talk about their feelings with other kids who had experienced a death. Not every kid likes to talk about it, but some kids do. And so it's important that we give them those opportunities to share. I'd like to start with some definitions though, so that we're on the same page when we're talking about grief and mourning. And if you were all in front of me, I'd ask you to raise your hand if you have heard of the 5 stages of grief. Most people have heard of it. It is something that's been in movies and TV shows and just kind of major media. It is something that for people, when they hear about it, they really assume that grief then is this linear process that goes through stages and that you start at the beginning and you get to the end and then you're done. And grief really is experienced in a different way. So I want to give you some other perspectives of what grief and mourning looks like. Education is just so helpful to bereaved people to find out what is natural. So William Worden was involved with a study, and he talked about bereavement being adaptation to the loss, and mourning is that process that kids are going through on their way to adapting, and that grief is that child's personal experience, those reactions that they're having that are related to the death. I'd like to do a little bit more about grief though. I think we grieve for all kinds of losses. Grief is a natural and expected reaction when we lose. Now, we may lose something that really isn't that meaningful. Like we have these CHC pens, Center for Hospice Care pens. There's a whole drawer full of them. If I lose one of those, it's not really going to impact me very much. But if I have a pen that was given to me by my grandma, when I graduated middle school and was going into high school because I love to write, and I've lost that pen, that is going to be harder to get over. We can't, if grandma has died, she's not able to give me another pen like she did. I think grief is something, it's so important to remember that it's based on our perception of the loss, not on someone else's perception. A kid might say, oh my gosh, I lost the pen my grandma gave me. And they're like, what's the big deal? Go buy another one. Well, it's not that simple because grandma's not here anymore. When we grieve a loss, it impacts our whole being. When we experience the death of someone important in our life, we can have feelings, thoughts, it impacts our attitude, it impacts our physical self. We can have symptoms of stress. It impacts how our brain functions, and we'll talk a little bit more about those natural grief reactions a little bit later. But I wanted you to just hear that grief impacts our whole being, and it also, for kids, they are also impacted, and that can affect how they behave at home, how they're doing at school, how they're functioning in general. So when we talk about mourning for children, and I mentioned how the 5 stages of grief is something that we really don't use when we're talking about mourning process. This is one of the ways that we talk about it, that when we are mourning, part of what we're doing is accepting the reality of the loss. We are also, we have to experience the pain. I think it's what we wish we could all kind of skip over. But we do experience pain, and it's a holistic view of pain. So it's not just the emotional pain that is kind of known or easy to recognize, but it's also social pain, it's spiritual pain, physical pain. We also adjust to that person being gone. So that's part of the process. What role did that person play in that child's life? Was that person their cheerleader? Was it the person who helped them figure out algebra? Was it the person who made their lunch every day or greeted them when they got home from school? And now that that person's gone, part of what that child is doing is adjusting to that loss as well. And then we know that when someone dies, our love, our relationship, our ambivalence, our conflict, our maybe anger that we have about that person or with that person, it doesn't just go away. So part of mourning is figuring out what to do with all those thoughts and feelings about that person. And there are lots of different ways that kids do that, and adults as well. Mourning too is impacted by a lot of factors. So we have someone experience a death, and even though that mourning, kind of those tasks of mourning that I mentioned, is really something that everyone's going through, grief is such a personal, unique experience because that child is the only person who had that relationship with the person who died. And so the factors that I'm going to mention definitely impact what that mourning and grief looks like. So for a child, who was the person in their life? And we already talked about roles and functions that were fulfilled by that person. And so all that was involved will impact mourning. So if you have a child who saw someone once a year and they really didn't play an active role in their life throughout the year, they're going to mourn that person very differently than someone who helped get them up in the morning, get them dressed, get them to school, get them fed, had fun with them. That's going to be a very different experience. What kind of relationship was it? That's going to impact mourning as well. Was it a loving, caring? Was it conflictual? What was that last conversation they had with that person? Was it a positive experience or not? And what is this loss the first death experience for this child? If it is, that will impact their mourning. If they've had other losses, then maybe they have a sense of what that might look like, even though another loss is going to be different because, again, of that unique relationship that they had. The circumstances of the illness and the death also influence mourning. So a death from suicide, for example, there's still a lot of stigma with that. And so is that child willing to talk about it or even mention it at school or with their peers because they might be concerned about the reaction that will happen. Adults still have that reaction too. So kids can also feel that way. Was the illness or death seen as preventable? That's going to influence mourning too. And then just a note about COVID. COVID, with the fact that it's its contagious nature, has been impacting a sense of guilt and feeling at fault. So, for example, you have a 10-year-old who went to school or went to a school function, gets contact traced, and so has a test. But in the meantime, they had spent time with grandma and grandpa. They find out they're positive, and then grandma and grandpa get sick. And maybe one of them ends up in the hospital. And if one of them would die, that child might associate then they were the ones who killed grandma or grandpa because they were sick with COVID first. So this is something that's really impacting mourning as well. And I did forget to say, I think in our world today, and I know there was also another shooting that happened in California. I think we are all grieving something with respect to COVID, whether we have experienced a death or whether we've adjusted to all the restrictions and the losses of, you know, kids going to school or not going to school. We have all been grieving something. And so please know that I honor that. And if something I say kind of touches off grief in you, please know, do what you need to do to care for yourself. This is being recorded, so you can come back to view it at another time if it becomes too hard. And so back to these factors, that the perception of whether it was preventable and then also how sudden it was can influence our mourning. If we have time to know that someone is dying, then it gives us time to maybe say what we need to say or do something with that person that helps our bereavement after. And when it's sudden, we don't have time to say goodbye or time to maybe say, I'm so sorry I said that to you. It can give more things to adjust to, regret or guilt or kind of those what ifs. With respect to COVID too, it has really impacted our ability to do ritual and have end of life traditions that families usually do. And so there's been more loss with that. And with respect to children, sometimes they're left out of rituals, of planning for rituals, of being a part of them. And I encourage you to invite children into that process. I think it's helpful to let kids know what might be going on. So if it's their first funeral, to let them know what they'll see when they come in, what it will be like, that your uncle's body will be in a box. It's called a coffin, and it will be open at the so you can see him. It will be covered over his legs. And there will be flowers and people. Some people will be crying. Some people will be sharing stories. I think it's important to let them know what it would look like, and then they can make that decision whether they want to go or not. But I think it's so important to invite them in. For young children, it's also very important, if you have the ability, to kind of assign someone or ask someone to be that child's kind of go-to person for that day. So if that child is kind of taken all they can take, that they could leave, and you as maybe mom or dad could still stay if you need to stay at the funeral. I think it's so important to invite them into ritual. We've had kids who have written notes to their loved one and put them in the coffin, and that can be very meaningful for the children. And what they're told and not told, such a big impact on their mourning. So if they're, again, brought into what's going on, that is helpful. If they learn about something after the fact and they learn that they could have been told sooner, it can impact their trust in you. Now, again, if you have something going on or grieving children in your life, you need to make the decision that feels right to you. And based on their development and who they are as a person. And kids can feel betrayed if they're not told about something, if it's known ahead of time. The social factors that are a part of mourning, what spiritual beliefs or religious traditions are followed, that can impact mourning as well. And of course, COVID has impacted people's ability to attend faith communities or attend them in the way they're used to. And also multiple losses can influence our mourning when you have multiple people that we're grieving. The support system also has an impact on our mourning. If there are lots of supports available, that helps. And with COVID too, that's impacted the ability for kids to be with each other, which has made their usual coping maybe not as available. And that can add to the mourning, add to what they're adjusting to, make it harder to cope. And then those secondary losses that can come after a death. Does the family need to move out of the home? Do they need to move school systems? And then they've lost their home, their bedroom, their friends, their neighborhood. And sometimes it has to happen just because of the circumstances. What we know is that the most we can keep the same is helpful for kids. When things need to change, as long as we're talking with them about it and honoring that it is a loss and it's hard, that's going to be helpful for them. Before I get going, were there any questions? I thought I'd check, Lisa, and see.
Not yet.
Okay, all right. Another factor that influences our mourning is just who we are as a person. So for children, their age, their understanding of death, what their developmental level is, each child's ability to cope with intense feelings or how they cope with stress. And then kind of that universal foundation that we have is their physical health, doing okay? Are they getting good nutrition, good rest, exercise? If we're doing well on those things, then it helps with our mourning and with the grief. Of course, that has also been impacted by COVID, the challenge of teaching kids from home or them having seems like additional work to do with school with them e-learning, and sometimes exercise too has been impacted just because of restrictions. I wanted to talk a little more in detail about the different age groups so that we have an understanding of developmentally where they're at. So for infants and toddlers, sometimes we don't see them as grieving because we get that they don't have an understanding of what death is. They don't have an understanding that it's permanent, that it's universal, and we know that they react to separation. So they may not understand death and what it is, but they do understand that something's changed and maybe that their primary caregiver is no longer there to care for them, and they can respond to that separation from that primary caregiver. They can also react and sense the stress of the adults in their life. And they can have changes in eating and sleeping and regressive behaviors. For those kids who have learned to talk in this age range, they can ask a lot of repetitive questions in general, and they can also ask about like, where's mom? And it can be very hard for the adults who are grieving to answer that over and over again. But they do grieve, it's just based on that separation that they experience. For preschool age kids, they're gaining the sense of autonomy that I'm kind of separate from you, but they believe that the world revolves around them. And so there is this sense that if the world revolves around me and someone died, that it's my fault. So important to speak this out loud to them, that it wasn't their fault that the person died. They still don't understand that death is permanent, or that everything that is alive will die. But they think they do see death as a departure, but they see it as temporary. They also can respond to the distress of caregivers, and again, repeat questions. And you might talk about how grandma's not coming to your birthday party. And then they ask, so is grandma coming or why didn't grandma come to my birthday party? They just don't understand that death is permanent. As we get into school age children, they still see death as reversible, but in this age range can begin to understand that it's permanent, but they don't quite yet get that it's universal, that everything will die. Sometimes in this age, they can see death as a punishment, And magical thinking is something that we really need to be careful about. They might think that they had a thought of maybe they were mad at dad because dad took their, said you can't play video games anymore today. And they had this thought that I wish dad would just go away. And then dad dies in a car accident. And then they connect those thoughts and feel like they caused dad's death. We don't always know that they're having those thoughts, again, unless we invite and open the door for conversation with them. And they still may not say it. It's very important, though, then to speak out loud. Even if the kid had nothing to do with it, they may still, in some sense, feel responsible. And so it's important to say you didn't do anything to cause this. As we get into the older school age kids, they're beginning to understand abstract ideas. Then they understand that death is permanent, that it's universal. This age range can sometimes be pretty focused on the details surrounding the circumstances of the death, about the body and what happened. That's natural. And so if they're asking questions, that would be expected. They can have fears about the future and start to be concerned about stigma with peers, which is why I think the services that we provide that our group, in a group setting, like our camp and our groups that we do, are so helpful so that they know they're not the only one. They're not the only kid who's experienced a death. And then for teens, we really see them as adults, but they're not yet. But they do understand those abstract concepts about death and about mortality, that everything that lives dies. And so they can be thinking about themselves as well, thinking about the meaning of life. Some of those more existential issues can be dealt with, can be experienced by them. They can also have unspoken magical thinking. So even adults can have magical thinking, but we tend to recognize it as such. And teens can have it too, but not want to talk about it. They can also feel responsible for the death. They're dealing with issues of identity. So teenagers, if it is a parent who has died, they can often have a lot of questions about, am I like mom? Am I like dad? How am I different? People will say, oh, you look so much like your mom, or you act just like her. And sometimes that's painful for them to hear when they're really missing them. And in this developmental stage, identity is something they're working on. So they might have questions or want to see pictures of that person who died when they were younger, or kind of learn more about them. Of course, they can have a range of reactions, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. I didn't point out, kids in that 9 to 12 age range can have suicidal ideation. Teenagers can as well. There is a grief reaction where you miss the person and want to be with them. That is different than suicidal ideation, where you're thinking about harming yourself so that you can join them. It's so important to ask kids if they're having thoughts about wishing to be with the person who died. Kind of opens that door to have that conversation, and then to talk with them about how it's so important for them to tell an adult if they're having thoughts about harming themselves. Also with teenagers, peers are so important, but there can be stigma for them as well. And they can have concerns about the future. Finances can be something that they worry about too. And in addition to developmentally and kind of where they are, how old they are, how the surviving parent, if it's a parent who died, or how the adults are doing in that child's life really impact how the kid will do with their mourning. So if a parent, there have been studies, if a parent is having a lot of psychological distress of their own, if they really perceive that their kid is doing okay and they're not checking in with their kid, about it that can lead to then not opening that door to talk about it, which can make it hard for the child in their mourning process. And so if the adults, if it's a surviving parent or the adults in that child's life are grieving too, it can be so helpful to enlist the help of other adults who are a little further out in their circle to provide support and to check in. Grief is a really self-focused experience, and it can be hard if you're grieving to be a grieving parent. And so having other supports, whether it be like our agency, we've provided support to parents, but it could be a faith community or your neighbors or someone who you trust to also help support that child when you're grieving intensely yourself. Then, of course, coping style supports, other family stressors that are going on. The less disruption in a child's life, the less they have to adjust to, and that can be helpful for them in their mourning. I also like to point out different grieving styles. So years ago, or when I first started at the agency, we talked about masculine and feminine ways of grieving, and I'm glad that we've moved away from that because it's not about gender. It really is just this continuum of people who are more comfortable with emoting and sharing that affection and exploring their feelings and talking about them. And then people that aren't comfortable with that and they really cope with like what they're thinking and behaviorally, and that it's a continuum. So a lot of people are blended. They might emote and explore their feelings, and at other times they're really doing a lot of processing within their thoughts, and maybe they're making a memorial for someone. And so I just want to point this out because in families, you could be grieving the same person, but how you're grieving could look very different. Each individual family member could have a different way of kind of what they're grieving, what they're experiencing. And I worked with a family that had experienced the death of a teenager, and there were concerns about one of the family members who wasn't crying. And so they came in and yes, this person wasn't crying, but they were doing a lot of thought about it and processing within their thoughts and also making things in memory of the person. And so they really were grieving. It just looked different. I just wanted you to be aware of that. So there's been a more recent theory called the multidimensional grief theory for children's mourning. And so I wanted to share just a little bit about this with you so you're aware of it. And then I do have a reference, and the references, you will get my PowerPoint, so you'll have all of this information. And they talk about how children have these three areas where they can be kind of adapting to this natural experience of grief, or adapting in a way that is where they're not functioning well. So they might be doing really well and not really bothered or having a hard time with the circumstances of the illness or death, but maybe having a really hard time with separation, really clingy or not wanting to go to school, a lot of anxiety about that. And so kids can be more adaptive or more maladaptive in how they're coping in these three different areas. If it would be helpful to talk a little bit more about that, we can, but I just wanted you to be aware of this, that again, that separation distress can be just that searching and longing and just having such discomfort over the separation from the person. And maybe they're coping well by continuing bond, by maybe talking with the person in their head or journaling and writing them letters or making things in memory of. Or maybe they're so distressed by that longing and yearning that they can't focus on anything else. And so it's, they're not functioning at school, or they're just so challenged to be separated from an adult in their life that they aren't going to school. The existential and identity crisis is really kind of what it says, that concerns about the meaning of life and why this happened and who am I, and that sense of self. And again, they might be coping with that adaptively, or maybe really struggling and with who they are and that sense of self, which is impacting their functioning. And the circumstance related distress has to do with really with traumatic bereavement. So sudden and unexpected deaths from maybe suicide, murder, accidents, or maybe they've witnessed something or have heard details about what's happened, and they just are having intrusive images. So they're trying to do algebra, and these pictures of the person who died and how they died keep getting in the way of them being able to focus and attend on what they have to do. So maybe their grades are going down, and they just can't stop thinking about it. They can't get it out of their head. Other kids might have really good grounding techniques where the images come in, but they're able to refocus. And so you might recognize this if you have grieving kids, where maybe they do seem to be struggling with certain aspects of this. And they're, again, if you have questions or if you want more information about this specifically, please know it's okay to reach out, and we can talk more about it. I did tell you I would share natural and expected grief reactions in children. And again, you'll get this, but the death of someone is a stressor. And so we can have stress reactions. So maybe if your child tends to have a stomach ache when they're stressed out, after the death, they might have more stomach aches, or maybe even worse than they've been before, or headaches. I think what's really important is to check in with the doctor, because some of these things can be caused by other illnesses, and we want to rule out other causes. And if the doctor says everything else is okay, then you could, reach out to get more support to help them cope with this as physical grief reactions. Our cognitive grief reactions, I mentioned some of them already: difficulty concentrating, focus, not so good, forgetful. How many times, Joey, do I need to tell you to put your shoes away? And they just can't, they're just really struggling to remember. Grief can impact how our brain functions. Kids can have an increase in nightmares. It can impact their self-esteem, and talked about magical thinking already. There can be sensory experiences as well. Kids can be really scared to talk about those. Adults can be scared to talk about those too. We can have, sometimes the dreams or nightmares are that experience for them, but they might sense their presence or hear this person call their name. Anyway, those can be experienced by kids, but they're often too afraid to talk about it. So again, opening that door and even asking them if they've had those experiences can be a helpful way. They might say no, but at least they know that you're open to talking about it. We already talked to you about the wish to join the deceased, and that how important it is if they have that to assess for suicidal risk. And so that's something too with school-age kids. It can be really helpful to contact the school, and since they're there a lot, to have another set of eyes so that they're aware of what's happening and can keep a check on the kids who are grieving. Emotional reactions, I think these are pretty, I think, common. If I asked you to list 10 grief reactions, emotional ones, you probably could come up with it. I want to point out relief. Relief is a natural grief reaction, and not everybody has it, but sometimes people feel guilty about it. Maybe someone was suffering, maybe they had mental illness and were struggling for a really long time, and it was really hard on the family. And so there might be some relief that they're gone. And that does not mean that the person didn't love them, doesn't wish that they were back, but they can feel guilty about it. So again, important to ask and open the door so that they're not carrying that weight on their own. Guilt is something we've talked about already too, that kids can feel guilty and to blame for something when it's not their fault. And so we need to ask and openly talk about that too. Behavioral grief reactions, this is one where we can see risky behaviors in kids, and this sense of, where they just don't seem to care about their safety. And they can also have an increase in grades. So sometimes kids might feel like, if I would have gotten straight A's, then everything would have been okay, and they work really hard. But a lot of times their grades decrease after a death. And so again, these are natural grief reactions and ones that we need to pay attention to, especially the self-destructive or ones where they're risk taking, so that we can talk with them and help them with safety. Something I also think is really helpful to know about our regressive behavior. So for younger kids, maybe they have graduated from their blankie or their pacifier, or sleeping with a stuffed animal, or maybe they finally were sleeping without the light on, and now they want to do that, or they're struggling and needing something more to self-soothe. Or kids that were potty trained and now are having accidents again. Those would all be natural grief reactions after loss. And so I just want you to be aware, so that if a kid is doing something that they had stopped doing, if it is not harmful, then it is okay to allow that, and to help them have that self-soothing for a while, until they maybe are feeling a little further out from those intense grief reactions that you can have in the beginning. And then we can have spiritual grief reactions as well. We can have a very strong faith or belief, or and then a death can sometimes lead to questions about that. Maybe why questions, maybe anger, if there is a belief in a higher power, feeling mad about what happened. And so just know that their spiritual beliefs can be affected too. And trauma is something that can be experienced by kids when a death is sudden, when they witness the death, or experience a threat to themselves, like maybe they're in a car accident where someone dies and they survive, but they were in the car and saw what happened. They can feel such really intense reactions like terror and helplessness. I guess I just point this out so that you know that this can happen too in kids. They can have trauma reactions, and we need to help them with the trauma reactions and to self-stabilize with coping and dealing with the reactions that they're having before they can get to that natural grief. So they actually then end up having a longer process because of that. So now that we know that kids grieve, that kids go through a mourning process, that there are all those factors that influence what their mourning looks like, and that they can have all these different reactions, what helps them? And clear information is very helpful. We don't want to use euphemisms. So saying passed away, for older kids who have abstract thought, that might be fine. For younger kids, it's not that clear, which if it's not clear, then it leaves them to kind of come up with their own thoughts about that. So we encourage you to use the word died or death, and then help to explain that. Ask them about their fears, what their worries are, so that you can address them and reassure them. We really need to listen, to validate their feelings, let them know that people grieve differently. So if they're not looking like their sibling, that's okay. Excuse me. Kids need nurturing, physical comfort, verbal and physical reassurance, understanding from you that they're grieving, even if they don't look like it. They can kind of come in and say, I really miss grandma. Can we call Joey so I can go play? And that might be it. So it doesn't look like they're grieving. So it's up to the adults to check in with them and ask and open those doors. I already talked about how it's important to include them in ritual and like the funeral or a service. And grief from the death of someone significant can overwhelm our coping tools. They overwhelm adult coping tools, so they can also overwhelm kids' usual coping that works for them. So sometimes we need to add to their toolbox and encourage them to try other things to cope. And I've said this multiple times, but invite them to talk and then listen. Also know that kids, even if the adults have not given this message directly, can sometimes feel like I need to take care of mom, so I'm not going to ask about dad. I'm not going to talk about him because she gets sad. And they take responsibility for that. And so it's really the adult's job to say, it is okay to talk about dad. I might be sad, but that's not your fault. I just miss him. And it's okay for us to talk about him. I've mentioned too, keeping consistency in the routine as much the same as you can. And also know that they're kids and they need opportunities to play. And then how, if you are modeling taking care of yourself and coping effectively, that is good for the kids too. I've already talked about how it's important to, as the adults, speak out loud that it's not their fault. Now, we have worked with kids. There are situations where a child or a teen, it does have some responsibility for what happened. We've had situations where a teenager was driving a car and was distracted, got into an accident and someone died. They are responsible for that decision. And they don't deserve to live the rest of their life with this shame. And so there is this process to try and help them cope with that. So I know there are situations where kids have some sense of responsibility in a situation. And other than that, it is so important to speak out loud. You are not responsible for what happened. Even if they had nothing to do with it, they need to hear that from you. Opportunities for memory making, especially on those important days. I think sometimes it's hard in blended families. So maybe a child experiences the death of their father, but the dad wasn't involved much. And so mom and stepdad have no, like, why are you grieving this person? They weren't really involved with your life the last 3 years. Well, maybe they had been for the first 7. We need to honor, again, the perception of the loss of the child and honor that relationship was important to them and to help them and support them to make meaning and do things in memory of and honor those days that are important, like birthdays or keeping in support with the school. Community supports can be really helpful. And I did want to share, we had someone who came to Camp Evergreen and initially came after his mom died, and then he came after his uncle died. So he came twice, and he shared that one weekend did more than I could have done for myself in a whole year. He didn't want to come to camp at first. He was apprehensive. And he said meeting other kids who were grieving was really helpful for him. So I just wanted to share that with you, and I had his permission to share that. So some lessons learned from families that we've worked with is that children overhear you. They hear adults talking, and if they only hear half of the conversation, they will fill in the blanks. And sometimes what they fill in the blanks with is not what we want them to be filling in the blanks with. So we need to honor that they're listening and hearing things. And again, if we are opening the door and asking questions and seeing their thought, asking for their thoughts or feelings about it, it might, you might know then that they've heard something and you can clarify or give them the right information. Also, it's okay if they ask a question, you're not quite sure what they're asking, to clarify that so that you're answering what they're asking. It's also okay, they might ask a question that you don't know the answer to. or that you're not sure, you're having questions about it yourself. Sometimes that has to do with what happens after death. Sometimes it might be what happened with their loved one's body at the time of death or before. Sometimes you can answer it, but you just need some time to prepare the answer. So it's okay to tell them that. You know what, that's so important. I'm so glad you asked, and let me think about that, and then I'll get back with you. And then please get back with them, don't forget. And I keep saying, invite, open the door, ask them for their thoughts and feelings. It is also okay to respect if a child doesn't want to talk about it. We can also utilize things that are happening in our community, in a movie, in a TV show, to give messages about death and dying too, or to ask them, what do you think that character's feeling after, their sister left, or their grandma died, or and talk about it in that way if the child is not wanting to talk directly about their person who died. And get creative. To encourage them to share their fears, keep those communication channels open. Again, invite other loving, caring adults to offer that support as well. And I think that last one is so important, that if you are a grieving adult and you are supporting a grieving child, it's important for you to have support for yourself. The more you have support, it will help you to be able to support them, which would be a gift to them. I know I got about 9 minutes left. Did want to just give you some images and thoughts about coping, because I mentioned how sometimes their natural coping is overwhelmed. And so you might need to bring in other coping tools. Of course, talking, creative expression, spending time in nature, music. The mindfulness is something that can be helpful to teach kids to do. Mindfulness is a kind of acknowledgement of this present moment and what you're experiencing with your senses, what you're seeing, hearing, touching, smelling, tasting, and sometimes focusing on this moment right now helps to move them away from maybe intrusive images or thoughts and feelings that they're having about the person who died, and help them then to refocus on what they need to accomplish. So learning mindfulness and helping them practice it can be a good tool to add to the toolbox. Journaling as well, that creative use of ritual, music, nature, maybe helping them find volunteer opportunities if they're older kids. And of course, bereavement counseling, talking to a counselor is another option. So we did kind of talk about some situations where kids need help. So maybe suicidal ideation would be something to reach out to get support for. And this child bereavement study that William Worden was involved in, there is this sense of a time frame, because these grief reactions can be natural in the beginning, but are they lasting? Is there challenges with functioning? And then that multidimensional grief model does talk about maladaptive ways of coping, and maybe kids need support if they're struggling with how to cope. So that if there's aggressive behavior or risk-taking, that anxiety that we talked about with that separation distress, if it's keeping them from going to school, or you're having to fight with them every morning about going to school, then maybe getting some support would be helpful. Ongoing somatic complaints where you've ruled out anything physical in origin, and the doctor thinks that maybe it is grief reactions, but it's not going away, it's not getting worse. Counseling could be helpful for that as well. Those sleep disturbances that don't go away, or eating disturbances too. The social withdrawal has been a little hard to recognize with the COVID restrictions. But that's something that can be a sign that kids need some extra support. We already talked about some of the other ones, that persistent self-blame or guilt, and impact on kind of their sense of self. Those would be signs that they could benefit from some extra support. So the Center for Hospice Care is one of those options. Again, the person who died does not have to have been one of our hospice patients. We do keep our scope narrow since we don't charge. So we do work with people who are grieving the death of a person. And these are some of the things that we're working on when we are involved with counseling, knowing that also if there's trauma involved, we would be working with trauma reactions as well before working on that natural grief. So we have individual counseling, family groups. I mentioned Camp Evergreen. And so you as adults can get support for yourself if you're grieving, provide that education to the kids, reassurance, inviting those opportunities to ask what they're thinking and what they're feeling, doing things in memory of. And these are very few of the books that we utilize here at the office. And I did have another image, When Dinosaurs Die. That's one we use for grief education as well. So at this moment, I just want to let you know that if you want more books or books that might be for a specific age range, or if you're looking for additional resources or you have any questions, it is okay to reach out to me by my email or by our office phone. There are some websites that you'll get in the PowerPoint that you can look at as well for more information. If you're teachers or you know teachers, grievingstudents.org is a really good website and has even learning modules. And healgrief.org is for college age grieving people. And then there are some books, some references that I have as well. So just thank you very much for spending time with me this evening. And I'll see if I'll stop the share and I'll see if there are any questions.
So there is a question, Holly. A couple of questions. The first one is, from Jennifer, if after a death, a child begins to worry quite a bit about others close to them dying, how might you recommend approaching this?
It's a pretty natural response for kids to worry about other people in their life. I think one of the ways that you can do that, or that you can respond, is to kind of be truthful about what people are doing to be safe. Like, and it might depend on how that person died. So let's say it was a car accident. You might talk with them about how, when I drive, I'm being safe. I wear my seatbelt. You wear your seatbelt. Dad wears his seatbelt. So some of those concrete things, and it might depend on their age as well. So you can do some reassurance about those things that you do have control over. I think it's hard because we don't have control over everything, but do some reassuring. The book, The Invisible String, is something that we use often with kids who are very fearful about leaving because they're concerned that if I, go to school and leave mom at home, something's going to happen to her. The Invisible String gives kind of a way for kids to think about how we stay connected, even though we're not together. I don't know, I guess if you have more specific questions about that, we could talk by phone or by email, but those are just kind of some general suggestions, is to reassure them with what you are doing, that people are doing to be safe. And sometimes that can be helpful.
Be very concrete, basically. Yeah. Kent is asking, does grief counseling involve an average number of sessions? And is there a difference between children and adults? I'm assuming for grief counseling.
So we are able to kind of meet people where they're at and provide care for them for as long as it's needed. And so we have some people who come in and they come to one session, and once they get the grief education and they learn that what they're going through is natural, then that's all they don't come back because that's all they needed. Oh, okay, then if that's okay, then I can do this on my own. When we have people who've experienced a death from murder or suicide where there's trauma, as in addition to the natural grief, then that can take a long time. And I mean, sometimes we've seen people for, months, for over a year, when there's been trauma, in addition to then getting to a place where they can have a natural grief process. For kids and youth, for kids versus adults, I think sometimes the adults bring the kids in because they're concerned about them. And they might come for 8 to 10 sessions and they're doing okay, and they're not having, their functioning is okay. And so we talk with the parents about, they seem to be doing all right. So for now we can stop. And then if you see these things happening, you can bring them back. For other kids, they do continue in a longer process because they are struggling with functioning, maybe on one of those, the dimensions that we talked about, whether it's separation or the circumstances or identity. And so we might work with them for a longer time. So I guess the answer is we'll work with them and kind of meet them where they're at and work with them for as long as is needed.
Okay. All right, Holly, thank you so much for your presentation tonight. Really informative and I think really helpful.
Okay, if I say one more thing, because it's something else just popped in my head, that we kids can also grieve again as they